Still in the There's someone coming from my position. Although watch out, there are guys in the yellow buildings. In front of you, two guys. Thanks.
And okay, and because you got to get to level 9, select with wizards, which very, I believe, usually had like over there. These guys do the goblin and then place Oh, ouch. Yeah. I'm trying to do this without using spell points. It might not be the wisest thing to do. I don't know what that means. Is because barrel of a gun right there. Obsidian gargoyles, immune to air, fire, and water. Ooh. That's going to be problematic. Let's go ahead and see if we can maybe slow them down or something. These are probably going to be the biggest problem here, and she's got a lot of them. so that's not really going to do anything. I'm going to have to do something like, well, that's going to be kind of useless into. Get these guys right here. Can I slow these guys down?
My name is Luca Faccio. I'm a photographer and live in Vienna. I've been able to travel to North Korea 7 times since 2005, getting a picture of the country's people and their worldview. During these trips, I saw more than I was allowed to be shown. Any journalist visiting the country is accompanied by minders around the clock. I've known mine for a few years now. Here, I'm taking pictures with them. They check what you film, who you talk to, and what about. I see the familiar images, but time and again I see new ones. I notice that there are a few new ideas for many of the people caught in this collective mindset. A paranoid system, one that I too have to submit to. It is a requirement on every visit.
A provincial town in northern China. In the streets, life is teeming. But hovering over this community, there's a menace. Many smaller towns already lie deserted, surrendered in a bitter struggle for land and livelihood.
Us not into temptation, and deliver us from evil.
Anglo-Saxon England, by the year 1000, was a very highly organised Christian country. It had a hierarchy, with the king at the top and different grades of people, thanes, free men, and the slaves knowing their places.
The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is our main source of evidence for the events around the year 1000. And so a very pessimistic outlook.
This was a very prosperous country, but increasingly vulnerable at the time to organised attacks from the north, from the Vikings.
In 995 came the long-haired comet, token of evil. 998, a Viking host seized the Isle of Wight. And now, 999, a Viking fleet has sailed up the Medway, burning and slaying in the Shire of Kent. Englalund is a land of small villages stretching from here in Kent to Northumbria. Our king, Ethelred, is far to the west in his capital, Winchester. I am Cuthbert, village priest, a man of learning. In this, my chronicle, I write about the 40 God-fearing souls of my village, true folk of Englalund. This village is our world. For 600 years, our forefathers have awoken in this place. They came across the sea to settle this island when the Romans left. Angles and Saxons, they were heathens then. But now we've seen the light of Christ. Wulfrich, eager blacksmith's son, first to empty his bladder, unloading last night's hornfuls of ale. Our kindreds live close around their hearth, woken by their children or the call of the cock.
3DO.
Not always in good temper. Fleas and lice are our bedmates under the thatched roofs.
What day was it?
Gunhild. She's still not betrothed. She must wed soon. Lord, keep her from sin.
Westall.
What really mattered to the Anglo-Saxons was health, physical health, and so ways hal, be whole, be healthy, was a typical top of the morning greeting. They were practical, earthy. I suppose that if you or I were tuning in to Anglo-Saxon channel just now, it would sound rather harsh and gravelly, a bit like waves dashing in up on a shingle beach. Ige, shada hada, peo to the kena, mo to the mara, to oramagan litla. All the words that come from our language that are good and short and tough and blunt and terse and hard and quick come from Anglo-Saxon. Womb, woman, man, earth, sea, ship, air, sky, love.
Everyday life was definitely a struggle. It was hard physical work. The average Anglo-Saxon was much fitter than we are, and they'd be much less likely to be overweight than people are now. That really wasn't a problem for the Anglo-Saxons. Only the very rich would ever get a chance to get fat. We don't think people actually washed very much at all. It's a bit hard for somebody who works on this period to say that we're actually dealing with a period of people who were really smelly.
Our village life is rooted in the land. We live alongside goats, pigs and poultry. We're hardy, not squeamish. We must rear and grow all we need. 100 years ago, King Alfred cast out the Viking raiders. But in my lifetime, in the reign of King Ethelred, the heathens from Daneland have come back to threaten our Christian people. There's work to do, taxes to pay, so that the king's army can keep the unbelievers at bay.
By the year 1000, Anglo-Saxon society was very highly organised. There was a very developed hierarchy with the king at the top and the slaves at the bottom, and different grades of people in between.
Slaves, we call them thralls, have lowest rank. They do heavy work with the pigs and the plough. They're chattel, left in wills, bought and sold. They carry no weapons, own no land. We shelter them, but if they run away, they may be stoned to death. No. That is our law. Slaves may not sit beside their lord. This is the slave's overseer, Godwin. His wife's heavy with child. He can't read like me, but he's learned to count. He's our reeve, the bailiff and collector for our thane, the local nobleman, Edwin. Godwin's a rich freeman, a churl, as we call them. His father left him over 60 acres in his will. Godwin grows barley, wheat and leeks. Or rather, the slaves grow barley, wheat and leeks for him. That's their place.
One may end up as a slave in Anglo-Saxon society through a variety of pathways, and one of these could be as a captive in a skirmish or battle. You could also be born into slavery. You could also end up as a slave if, say, you had been convicted of a crime, you were unable to pay the fine that was required of you, then you would end up in penal slavery.
Alvich is our blacksmith, a less wealthy freeman. He makes tools and weapons, and so is given a 20-acre holding from our thane. Like his forefathers, Alrich passes on his craft to his son Wulfrich. But in war, there's more call for arrowheads and shields than for church crosses. And we mustn't overlook the weefmen, the women, or we'll never hear the end of it. Their hands, like the Lord's hands, are never idle. Every morning they grind the quern to give us our daily bread.
Making bread was women's work. It was one of the hardest, most time-consuming things that they did, basically because of grinding the flour. One of the reasons that they didn't make all their corn into bread was that grinding flour was such hard work and took such a long time. There's a big difference actually between Anglo-Saxon teeth and modern teeth, because of course their flour was stone ground and little bits of grit would come off into the flour. So all the time people were eating bread, they were grinding their teeth down, and by the time somebody was, well, I suppose in late middle age, they might actually have no enamel left on the tops and bottoms of their teeth at all. It could have been quite painful.
Life in one of the wooden houses would have been quite cosy because they would have had a fire going all the time. It would have been smoky. All the smoke would have gone up to the upper half. And we do know that quite a lot of them suffered from sinusitis, presumably contracted from sitting around in smoky environments.
Latrine deposits obviously contain people's bodily waste, but also intestinal parasites, particularly worms. Tapeworm that we have now, and then they had whipworm, and there was a nasty one called ascari, which they had as well, which could be about a foot long. Of course, they didn't have toilet paper. What they did use were leaves, moss, anything that was reasonably soft. There's actually a joke. What is the cleanest leaf? And the answer is holly, because of course it would be quite unsuitable for that purpose.
We know they combed their hair because we find their combs, lots of combs, quite elaborately made. Some of those combs have nits on them.
Women, certainly married women, would wear a cloth over their head all the time that they were outside. There was some kind of belief that women's attraction lay in their hair. You know, there's a pretty girl with nice long blonde hair. And you know, once somebody was married, she wasn't supposed to be attractive to everybody else.
No veil yet for Brynhild. She's unwed. Her father Oswald is away fighting the Vikings. Her charms have been noted by Godwin's brother Edmund, a wealthy churl and an ungodly bully. Kicked by his horse, they say. Kunhild's father is in our Thane's war band, part of the Fyrd, the Angler army tracking down the Viking foe. Wulfrich has been chosen one day to take his place at our Thane's side. It's a great honour for a mere blacksmith's son. He could win booty, be granted his own land. All the better to win over some girl.
War, of course, provided opportunities for people as well as causing many problems. So there was much more social mobility than there had been before. And someone who perhaps hadn't had the chance to become a soldier and then possibly to improve his status might well find that a place was available for him in the Fyrd because so many other men had died.
Kunhild has more than one swain seeking her hand. Wulfrich, he may not come back from war. Edmund, his wealth may turn Kunhild's head in time. Praise the Lord, the joy of giving life.
The main thing about childbirth was that it was extremely painful. It was the curse of Eve that you have to suffer to bring forth children. And in the year 1000, there was no effective pain relief. Life expectancy on average was very low. The worst time was the first 5 years of life, and within that, the time around birth. But childbirth was really a female thing. All the women in the village would probably come and help. So there would be a whole load of women in the house, and the men probably wouldn't be anywhere to be seen.
It is Lethe, midsummer. Tomorrow I christen Godwin's kin. I follow meekly in the footsteps of St. Augustine, who came from Rome 400 years ago to baptize us England. My flock are God-fearing, but theirs is a life of toil. As priest, I seek truly to unfold the Gospels to them.
In the year 1000, there was still going on a revival in the church, which had begun in the reign of Ethelred's father, Edgar, and it was beginning to have an effect on village communities. Ordinary people would now be expected to go to church perhaps more frequently than they had done before, but the great hope of the reformers was that the parish priest would explain to people what Christianity was about, what the meaning of the services was, and how they could infuse it into their everyday lives.
Allmächte Gott, where hina, ser his liv, glad und främmerfull.
Baptism around the year 1000 was very similar to a baptism service today. The role of the godparent was important. The role of the family was very important as well. It was in fact the defining moment in becoming a Christian. You needed to be baptised to be a Christian.
Ill tidings. Oswald, old William, warrior of our settlement, Cunhild's father, has been gravely wounded. Our Lord Thane Edwin has ridden over 30 miles to bring him back from the field of battle.
The first thing for a wound would be a salve, I suppose, to cover it up and to soothe it. And those would be usually made of fat with some herbs in them. But it was also understood that it was important to keep wounds clean, so they would be cleaned with things like honey. Of course, even if a wound had apparently healed up, somebody could still become ill. They could get what we now understand as blood poisoning, so they'd be feverish and they'd be debilitated, and they could even die in the end.
It's hard to see Oswald growing many more grey hairs. A harsh outcome for such a worthy man. I pray he lives for the sake of his daughter. Poor poor Kunhild. Lord, keep us from the Vikings who bring death to our door. I have a sad tale to set down. It is the year of 999, last summer before 1000. While King Ethelred cowers inland, Vikings rob our kingdom. Our warrior Oswald has fallen foul of the heathen swords and lies dying. His daughter, Kunhild, can only watch his faring forth.
In the year 1000, the king was King Ethelred II, who has the nickname the Unready. That's in fact a play on his name. Ethelred, noble counsel, Unred, no counsel, or possibly ill-counselled. And it's thought that he got his name from being badly advised by some of the nobles around him. Soon after Ethelred had come to the throne in 978, Viking raids began again. And so by 1000 there must have been a lot of fear and insecurity in many parts of the country.
How many more warriors' broken bones will lie on this hill before the Vikings are done? Who guards us at this evil time? We paid twice over, once with the lives of our sons, and again with our hard-earned silver.
Tax was raised not only by the king in order to sort of swell his own coffers, but by around the year 1000, enormous payments of silver were being made to the Vikings. For example, we find more Anglo-Saxon coins in the Viking homelands than we do in England.
The thieving heathens will not take these, I pray. A sad day, but Oswald's silver will not go amiss in the work of Christ.
The priest was responsible for burying the dead, and this often led to great disputes over where a particular person should be buried, because a payment had to be made to the priest upon the burial, and we know that priests often fought over corpses in a rather unceremonious manner in order to acquire not just the corpse, but more importantly, the burial fee.
Work stops for no man, even the dead. Summer comes to an end and we must ready ourselves for the cold months. Life must go on, even for poor Kunhild.
Anglo-Saxon England was rich, and that depended largely on sheep. The sheep is really the ideal multi-purpose animal. It's got the fleece, which you can use to make clothes, it'll keep you warm. It gives you meat, it gives you tallow, which you can use to make candles, and you can milk it as well.
The silver penny goes right back to Anglo-Saxon England. And it was a coinage that was very much centralised. It was withdrawn every 6 years to be reminted.
For Minham to Wardenham Weaver.
One great concern, of course, was for the minting of false coins. And if a moneyer was caught minting coins in the woods, is another way that they put it, then he could expect to have his hand chopped off and fastened above the doorway of his mint. This was a clear indication then that the person had wronged.
No talk of coins today. My villagers must forget worldly sins, for it is Sunday. A day of rest for most, but a day of work for me, as I watch over my wayward flock.
Priests were responsible for the pastoral care of villagers at this time, and they were responsible for making sure that the villagers adhered to the religious feasts. They were responsible for making sure that the villagers went to church on a Sunday. And the law was very clear that villagers mustn't do any work at all on a Sunday, or else they'd be fined. They weren't allowed to carry anything anywhere. And the priest was responsible for ensuring that that happened. So that might sometimes mean that the priest wasn't particularly popular.
Fishing. I should find him.
This child.
Washing was considered a luxury. It was something that nuns and monks gave up when they entered the monastery because it was, I suppose, an affectation. It was something that was nice, but that wasn't necessary. And the ordinary Anglo-Saxon peasant certainly never saw a bath and probably didn't wash very much at all either.
What's she up to? Bathing. Bathing can only lead to sin. Eve offers up the apple in my own garden. Do not eat, Ulfrich.
The church has never had a very good opinion of any form of sex. Lawful marriage is the least of evils. It's not particularly good in itself, but all other forms of sex are constantly fulminated against. Fornication, incest, rape, sleeping with nuns, you name it, some priest has complained about it.
When it came to marriage, this wasn't an entirely personal choice. Marriages were contracted between families, and women wouldn't have a lot of choice about who they were to marry. Although the law is clear that women weren't forced to marry someone that they didn't wish to marry.
Kunhild has made her choice, but I fear Edmund has not given up.
Ulfricus niet knapper, a smithis kun abath land and lot. It's will do for weaver, where you thumb near thorough land. Lahi! Ah, gaff, I'm horing sunna. Oh, sorry, yeah.
All of the adult male villagers belonged to a tithing, which was almost like a local neighbourhood watch group, which was responsible for making sure that everybody adhered to the law. And that was really the point of contact between the law, which was being created by the king and by his advisors, and local people.
Beyond the tithing, the village works together to defend our kingdom. From making arrowheads to giving up a son to be feared, the army, our settlement gives sacrifice for the greater good. This may be the last time the blacksmith's two sons play together. It is time for Wulfrich to go and fight on our behalf. He may be down in battle, but of course the price for running away would be shame and lawful death. I pray he will be more than just arrow. Wulfrich leaves our village to face the foe outside.
Farewell, Snapper.
Toward each shire, our people build strongholds or burhs where armies muster. The war band heads to Hastings-burh with our Thane, Edwin.
In the year 1000, the king, Ethelred, was a very weak and ineffectual king. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records when the army was supposed to be going out, it was coming in. When the enemy were in the west, then the army mustered in the east.
Viking raiders are near. Only God knows Wulfrich's fate now.
The Anglo-Saxon sense of fate was that the shape of our life, the time we were born, the main events in our life, the time we die, was already determined. But I think that the shapers, the gods, had nothing to say in shaping the colour of our lives. The way in which, if we have a sense of humour, it can be a lot more bearable, even if we're suffering.
Kuninges je zelda, Quen met chwilum, chwit lokedu, hand on Habe me on Belsme.
Any event in the Anglo-Saxon period would lend itself to verse, which is how most people would have heard the news. The poet remained a key member of society, articulating the stories that told the English about themselves and about their origins, a medium by which, in other words, they identified themselves as English.
What? We gardena, jerdachum, theod kuninga thrumja frunon.
Which loosely translated, what or what is almost the same word, drawing attention to the declamation, so all would be hushed when the great word what went out. What, how we have heard of the erstwhile fame of the spear-wielding folk kings of the days of yore.
Oft, schulcherving, schaden threatum, monechum maitum.
Beowulf is the great epic that forms the beginning of literary art in the English language.
I wish my congregation was as rapt as this of a Sunday. They're always enthralled by the old tale handed down word of mouth of that monster killer Beowulf and those ale rowdy warriors in their hall.
They have a great feast, and there's of course singing in the feast. And it is the sound of this singing that introduces us to the next major character in the poem, namely the monster Grendel.
Beowulf was brave.
We hear the tale again. Grendel can't stand the sound of the singing.
Grendel, perhaps the most frightening monster in all of English literature. It is quite possible to trace back the monster in the film Alien or the monster in the film Predator to Grendel as their prototype. And Grendel is immune to edged weapons of any kind, which Beowulf is aware of, so he proposes to grapple him in a great wrestling match. And Grendel is surprised that one of his victims actually fights back, and what's more gets him into a very strong wrestling hold that appears to be a kind of half Nelson. And eventually he does manage to wriggle and twist himself free, but at the cost of his own arm, which Beowulf is left hanging onto in the same grip.
Beowulf is enormously significant because it's been deepened into the most profound comment on human life. Someone who is a real thinker and who says, what on earth is our life about here on earth? How are we to make sense of it? And what are the principles that we must live by?
Und ich selber sallo. Sacha hat ich harte.
And by now everyone's getting a bit fed up and getting a bit more rowdy and a bit more stupid with ale or mead. And they say, go on, tell us a riddle. And maybe he starts asking a riddle. He said, well, I've had enough of this. Why don't you tell me a riddle? Because the riddles are the song of the unsung labourer. They're the songs of the illiterate.
No, so Edmund, give us riddles.
There are some riddles which are very saucy which purport to describe objects around the kitchen and around the household, but actually describe parts of the female and male anatomy.
Sterthol mean is swerd. Her stunde itchin bedde. Nathan ruch natwa. Seo the mech newath. Weef wundenlock. What's bith that air?
Oh! Look, hey, Look.
Cunhild is fearful for Wulfrich, who faces true monsters more fierce than Grendel. It is Harvest Monath, fall in the year of our Lord, 999. Since we were overcome at the Battle of Malden 8 years ago, our people have feared the Viking men who raid our kingdom. My fellow churchmen whisper that the Vikings are the Antichrist who will bring the world to an end. And out into this darkness beyond our village has gone Wulfrich, our blacksmith's son, with Thane Edwin, fighting the Vikings.
The purpose behind the Viking raids around the year 1000 was to raise money. So they were partly looking to taking booty, but like many other early medieval peoples, they were relying upon taking tribute, by which they meant they were relying upon people paying them money to go away. So they tended to ravage an area, literally burning places down, killing cattle and even people, until they made such a nuisance of themselves that somebody would organize a tribute to take them away. As the raids got on, people would find it increasingly difficult to pay that money. Churches were having to sell their silver, men were having to sell their land, and if you didn't have any land to sell, you might even sell yourself or members of your family into slavery. The Viking attacks were seen as evidence for the wars which in the Book of Revelations are mentioned as the type of thing that we'll see in the reign of Antichrist, and after that there will be the end of the world.
The church was very pessimistic about the Viking raids. Many churchmen thought that the Viking raiders were some sort of divine punishment from God because they hadn't been adhering to their prayers or hadn't been going to church enough.
Undoubtedly, certain sections of the ecclesiastical establishment believed that the world would end 1,000 years after the birth of Christ or the death of Christ. Archbishop Wulfstan has left us a very impressive sermon addressing the English as Leovan men, beloved men, ye knoweth that soth is, know what the truth is. This world is on Ofster, this world is in haste, and hit nealakath dam ender, and it rushes to its end. This is one of the most explicit references to the fact of the belief that the world would end in some form or other around about the turn of the first millennium.
The Battle of Malden was the first time that the Anglo-Saxons suffered a serious defeat in this round of the new Viking attacks. One of the oldest and most respected ealdormen, Bertnoth, was killed, and I think this was a warning signal to the Anglo-Saxons that they could be in trouble.
South, get out! Give me a Mullen! Not afraid! Hoot! 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 Hoot!
The lines which the ealdorman of the English, whose name was Bertnoth, speaks to the Danish herald, who's asking him for Danegeld rather than fighting a battle, could be applicable to any invader. One can imagine it being said to Napoleon, or Hitler, or even some of the bureaucrats in Brussels. When Bertnoth said, "Ye hear the stool saileth what this folk saith." Translated, "Do you hear, sailor, what this folk says? We'll give you spears as tribute and time-tested swords."
What were the Vikings like? They were out eager. There's a terrific word in Beowulf. It describes a ship which was icy and eager to sail. Well, that's how I think of the Vikings. They were thrusting, confident, opportunistic, and enormously successful. They were also arrogant, cruel, and lacking in compassion.
Battles at the time would be a horrific place to be. The only thing that kept men together was the fact that they knew the men around them.
Fighting up!
The archaeological evidence tends to come from skeletons and shows particularly that sword blows could be quite devastating, cleaving skulls, amputating limbs.
Winter comes, but not all will live to see it. Some pigs we cannot feed all through the cold months. The time has come for them to feed us.
One of the months in the autumn was called Blotmonath, which means blood month. They always wanted more meat because it was protein and fat that were least abundant in their diet.
The Anglo-Saxons had far less variety of foodstuff than we do, and not all species that we think of as being native species existed then. They didn't have any potatoes, they didn't have any tomatoes.
Leeks, they were very keen on leeks. That was their favourite vegetable, and some kind of cabbage stuff. But they weren't very bothered about vegetables. What they really liked was meat.
The archer would be looking for gaps in the line where men weren't concentrating on him so that he could try and get a clear shot. If you know that the arrows are coming, with a shield it's relatively easy to defend yourself. The archer would be moving around as much as possible, trying to catch people who weren't concentrating on him.
Anglo-Saxon beer would have looked cloudy. It's made basically in the same way as it is now, out of malted barley. People did drink a lot more beer than we would expect because the water wasn't necessarily very clean. They might have a nice well, but they might not. They might have to get their water from the river, and that would be the same river that they were throwing all their rubbish into, so they wouldn't be very keen to drink it.
A happy day. Our Lord Thane Edwin and Wulfrich have come back. This time they fought off the Viking swords. They're safe. Till spring at least, when the Vikings will come again. Wolfrich has been lucky with war spoils. We should melt that down and make something for my church.
Fin is est, well. It's Anfe land.
I do think the Anglo-Saxons had a good time, or were certainly capable of having a good time as much as we are today. The idea of a great feasting hall presided over by a benign leader or king was very much their idea of heaven on earth, and for many of them, their idea of heaven itself. Fighting all day and drinking all night. So what more could you want?
The Anglo-Saxons are underrated. There's this extraordinary idea that before the Norman conquest, there was a miserable dark age of savage peasants who had no idea how to organise life. Whereas in fact, Anglo-Saxon England is the starting point for much that we think of as valuable and significant about later medieval and modern England.
Our language, our place names, our churches, many systems of government all go back to the Anglo-Saxon period. It's not true to say that the history of the country begins with 1066. That's a mere blip on the history of the people of England.
It is Yule. Dawn is near. On the first day of the 1000th year since the birth of our Lord. All seems well. Our future lies with the like of Wolfrich, Cunhild, and the children they'll bear. The world has not come to an end. Archbishop Wulfstan was wrong then. Life moves on. Will our people still be here in another 1,000 years?
There are some characteristics of the English today and of the Anglo-Saxons which seem uncommonly like one another. What we have now, as the year 2000 dawns, is something stoical, kind of backs-to-the-wall toughness. There's a melancholy, there's some fatalism, and I think there's a great love of ceremony, of doing things the right way, of ritual. In sum, I think we'd be fools not to look back, to look forward.
On a late November morning in the year 1095, this man, Pope Urban II, delivered a sermon that would transform the history of Europe. His rousing words transfixed the crowds gathered here in the French town of Clermont, and in the months that followed, his message reverberated across the West. The age of the Crusades had begun. The Pope proclaimed a new holy war against Islam for control of the most hallowed site in the Christian cosmos, the sacred city of Jerusalem. Urban's call to arms initiated a struggle that would rage for 2 centuries, one that fires the imagination and fuels debate even today. The story of the Crusades is remembered as a tale of religious fanaticism and unspeakable violence, of medieval knights and jihadi warriors, of castles and kings, of heroism, betrayal, and sacrifice. But now, fresh research and contemporary evidence from both the Christian and Islamic worlds sheds new light on how it was that these 2 great religions waged war in the name of God. Why hundreds of thousands of Christians and Muslims answered the call to crusade and jihad. And who ultimately won the war for the Holy Land. From the summer of 1096, between 60 and 100,000 Christians, men, women, and children, set out to walk some 2,500 miles across the face of the known world. Their goal? Jerusalem. Not since the distant glories of ancient Rome had a force of this size been assembled. Rich and poor, peasants and knights, these were the first crusaders. Christian soldiers who endured unimaginable suffering during an armed pilgrimage that lasted for 3 years. So who were they, and why did they fight? When Urban II became Pope, Christianity was in turmoil, split between the Greek Church of the East and the Latin West. The papacy itself stood on the brink of overthrow, embroiled in a long-standing feud with the German Empire. But Urban had a plan. Determined to reassert papal authority, in the autumn of 1095 he came to France, where he would launch a titanic armed pilgrimage, known to history as the First Crusade. By November 1095, the Pope was ready to unveil his plan. Here in Clermont, in central France, he announced his intention to deliver a special sermon. And on the 27th of November, hundreds of people crowded into a field outside the town to hear him speak. A grave report has come from the lands of Jerusalem that a foreign race, a race absolutely alien to God, has invaded the land of those Christians and has reduced the people with sword, rapine, and fire. Urban's speech was the moment of genesis for the concept of a crusade. It was primarily designed to meet the needs of the papacy, and it contained a brilliantly conceived hook. The coming expedition would target the greatest pilgrim destination in the Christian world, the holy city of Jerusalem, which lay in the hands of Islam. But the Pope had a problem. Jerusalem had fallen to Islam more than 400 years earlier, so he could hardly claim this as a fresh crime. To lend urgency to his call, Urban therefore turned to one of the most powerful and dangerous forces in human history, the idea of otherness. of an alien enemy guilty of ghastly crimes who must be repelled. These men have destroyed the altars polluted by their foul practices. They have circumcised the Christians, either spreading the blood from the circumcisions on the altars or pouring it into the baptismal fonts. And they cut open the navels of those whom they choose to torment with loathsome death, drag them around and flog them, before killing them as they lie prone on the ground with all their entrails out. The Pope created an anti-Islamic onslaught peppered with propaganda. His graphic imagery bore little relation to the reality of Muslim rule in the Holy Land. Nor was Urban's call to arms directly inspired by any recent atrocity in the East. Nevertheless, his attack ignited a fire of vengeful passion as news of the crusade resounded across Western Christendom. The idea of the crusade was unleashed in a spiritual age, an era which in many ways was wholly alien to our own. Today we might be acculturated to notions of tolerance, skepticism, and religious difference, but a singular truth bound together almost every human being alive in 11th century Europe: unconditional and total belief in Christianity. The Church taught that every human would face a moment of judgment, a weighing of souls. Those found to be pure would be rewarded with everlasting paradise in heaven. But if you were a sinner, then you faced certain punishment, an eternity of gruesome torment in hell.
This is the main tympanum of the cathedral. It depicts the Last Judgment according to the Gospel of Matthew, and it says that in the last day of the world, Christ will come back in his glory and to send the good ones, the elected ones, to heaven and the bad one to hell. And that was carved in the middle of the 12th century by a man called Gilbertus, and he signed up his name right below Christ's feet, right in the middle of the main tympanum.
This magnificent sculpture cycle depicts the Last Judgment, and it's the perfect evocation of the whole idea of agony and ecstasy in medieval Christianity. At Christ's right hand we see salvation. 3 children are being lifted to heaven by an angel. And above, a set of beautifully carved, elongated angels lift the saved up to paradise. On the other side, at Christ's left hand, we see those less fortunate, those who have sinned and will face an eternity of torment in hell. There is a man bearing a bag, probably a bag of money, meaning he is a miser or a moneylender. He's among the damned. And next to him is a woman with a pair of snakes gnawing on her bare breasts, showing that she was lusty or lewd. And perhaps most evocatively of all, a man with a look of fear and agony on his face, as a pair of giant demonic hands reach down to strangle him and pull him through the gates of hell. This is the tableau of horror laid out before us. This is what Giselbert wanted his audience to understand: the consequences of sin in the medieval world. Primed to seek redemption, Western Christians were thus enthralled when Urban II announced his expedition to the Holy Land. The price would be huge. The faithful would have to give up everything to participate in a terrifying, near-suicidal journey into the unknown. But in return, the Pope seemed to be promising a guarantee of eternal salvation. tens of thousands of ordinary Christians responded to the Pope's brilliantly conceived campaign. But Urban's target audience was the aristocracy of Western Europe, a violent warrior class fighting for survival in a world of bloodthirsty lawlessness. These warlords would become the Crusades' leaders, Christian knights, for whom the Pope's call to arms solved a very particular dilemma. The Pope knew only too well the anxiety of Christian warriors trapped in a worldly profession imbued with violence, yet taught by the Church that bloodshed was sinful. The real genius of Urban's crusading ideal is that it solved this dilemma, reconciling faith and violence. Urban spoke of a new sacred struggle in which fighting would not simply be permitted, but actively encouraged and even rewarded. The day after Pope Urban's sermon at Clermont, Count Raymond of Toulouse, the most powerful secular lord in southern France, became the first nobleman to commit to the crusade. Determined to prepare his soul for the grueling expedition ahead, Raymond then came here, to this cathedral in Le Puy. The Count made a large donation to secure the favorable intercession of the Virgin Mary, and, according to one chronicle, requested that, so long as I live, a candle should burn for me incessantly day and night upon the altar before the revered image of the Mother of God. For noblemen like Raymond and the retinues of knights and infantry that came with them, the crusade offered the promise of eternal salvation, and in return their personal fortunes would bankroll the sacred expedition. Raymond of Toulouse became the crusade's elder statesman, but he was just one of scores of rich and powerful noblemen for whom the combined allure of military conquest and religious redemption proved irresistible. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, a pious duke whose lands extended from northeastern France to the Low Countries and Germany. Despite a long-standing feud with the papacy, Godfrey was so enthralled by the crusading